You know, every day I come across something, and I just kind of wonder about it. But I have a ritual myself. Now, some people think ritual, they think about like ugly old green witches making up some kind of brew around a campfire or something, making some poison to the princess, right? Well, that's not what I look at as. A ritual to me is a simple word describing a series of actions. Actions are strong. You have to have a series of value, as I see it, beyond the particular implications, situations. A ritual is just like, for an example, drinking a cup of coffee in the morning. You know, you go to a certain place in the house, you got a certain cup, you want to drink your coffee out of, so you drink it. That's a ritual. Everybody drinks coffee or maybe tea. But to me, my ritual and my intention every day that I can't wake up, and I wake up, and I look around my room, I look at Brian, I kind of look out the window, I think of my brother going to work. That's his ritual, and he works hard. He doesn't start staying at his house after the flood of the jungle, we call it. There was 15 people that were stranded on an island, and I made a phone call and I told the Chico police, I said, look, when was the last time you were at the jungle? I got 15 people that's stranded on an island down there and can't get off. I said, what are you going to do? You got to go rescue these people. I can't swim out there. They can't swim down the bank. And it was pretty sad. Those were my friends, my family. And I really felt bad. But what I'm really trying to say is I go camp to camp about every other day. I go camp to camp and I see what the needs are of all the homes in my town. I've been here, I've been homeless for 13 years. And you know, between my time in and out of prison, and I don't have a good rap sheet, but as I walk, I take walks with the people every day. And sometimes when I take that walk, I'll grab a rock at the beginning of my walk. And I know my destination because I know where I'm going beforehand. And when I get to where I'm going, I would drop that rock. That's my whole intention. That rock keeps me solid. When I drop that rock, I know my destination has ended. And I feel that if I stay strong with myself and with my people, as I call the homeless, I can make those goals every day just by carrying that rock and dropping it. That's the beginning and the end of my whole intention. My intention is to help every homeless person I possibly can. I go out of my way sometimes to help them. I kind of get like away. I give them more than I do for myself. That's okay because that's my calling, and I really feel that that is my calling, and I will continue to do that. And since I've joined the Poor People's Campaign and we formed a homeless union, my eyes have opened up so much. When I went to Washington, D.C. and I first met Liz, it was so awesome. I was on the stage. There's 50,000 people out in front of me. And I'm going, can I do this? And I'm looking at Brian, and I look back and I see Liz. And it was the look in her eyes and her face that told me I could do it. She didn't have to say a word to me. I would like to introduce you to Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis.
Here with everybody. as Raylan said, my name is Liz, and I am very proud of being the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. So today is Dr. King's birthday observed. And we all know that 2019 would have been his 90th birthday. We are 50 years since he was killed, and there's no place that I would rather be on Dr. King's birthday than here in Marysville, California, in Northern California, with leaders from the Homeless Union, from Salinas, from Oakland, from Marysville, and from all over the state, from Chico, having spent a day in Paradise and Chico. And so I started to be involved in this movement about 25 years ago. And what brought me in was the National Union of the Homeless back in the late 80s and early 90s. I was organizing with and experienced homelessness myself back in the 90s, where we had encampments, much like the one that we visited today. When Raylan was telling stories today about folks being sent to her, sent to some of the camps where people are staying. I remember when we had one encampment in the center of town in Philadelphia. It was a tent city that we set up at where the Quaker Lace Factory used to be. I remember the VA hospital, the Veterans Administration Hospital, discharging patients to our camp. I remember Philadelphia Legal Services bringing some of their clients to our camp. I remember folks from some of the housing agencies across the city, when it was time for them to close up shop and go home, and it was 5 o'clock, coming and saying, well, there's some homeless people over there organizing, so maybe they can help you. And this was at a time when there were more abandoned housing units than there were homeless people. We live in a country where we have more abandoned, empty, luxury housing units than we do homeless people. We live in a country and a moment in time when they can build a prefab house in 45 minutes. And we have more homeless kids than during the Great Depression. When they can 3D print a house, but homelessness is affecting people all across this state, all across this country. And so there's nowhere I'd rather be than with the Poor People's Campaign of California and the California Homeless Union celebrating Dr. King's birthday. So I want to start this evening with a Bible passage from Matthew 8. And as I read that passage, I want to talk for a minute about the setting of the story, what happens right before, so we kind of know what's going on when we get to it. Right before, in Matthew 5 and Matthew 6 and Matthew 7, is the Sermon on the Mount. So we have Jesus laying out what God's desire for the world is, how things ought to be, how things would be if we followed God's will. And it's about the poor and the homeless being blessed. And it's about those who hunger for righteousness being filled. And those who mourn, organizing, and being comforted. And then Matthew 6 teaches us a prayer that Jesus wants us to pray. And we said the Lord's Prayer in Paradise this morning. And that prayer is about how life here on earth can be beautiful and full, and that everybody could have our needs met. And then Matthew 7 says that we're supposed to do unto others what we would want them to do unto us. So the Bible's pretty clear about how we treat each other, how we treat us poor people is how we treat God and what God wants from us. And then we get to Matthew 8. And Matthew 8 starts with a story of a sick person, a marginalized leper who has been rejected by society, who comes to Jesus and says, "If you choose, you can heal me. If you choose, I can be made well." So Jesus responds, "I do choose," and heals him. And then continues to gather more people around him. More people that want to join this movement that Jesus is trying to organize. Folks are saying, "Can I come along? Can I join?" And Jesus thinks it's really important then to say who he is and where he comes from. And he says this passage, "Foxes have dens, and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man doesn't have anywhere to lay his head." Now, I'm kind of skeptical of lots of biblical scholars, but there's a few that I like. And one that I really like says that actually how we should read that line is that foxes have dens and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man, Jesus, is homeless. And then he kind of keeps on going and says, actually we should read this passage even a little bit more collectively, not only about Jesus. And it should be that foxes have dens and birds of the air have their nests, but humans are the only ones who are homeless. And then the story continues, and it's about people joining a movement of poor and homeless folks to turn over the tables of society and make life good for everybody. So I start with the Bible because I think for too long, many of us have been blamed for our poverty. Many of us have been called lazy and crazy and stupid. We've been bombarded with messages that if God wanted to end homelessness, he would do so. We've been lied to and told that if we just prayed more, or worked harder, or had fewer babies, or did less drugs, we wouldn't have to suffer so much. But as someone who loves the Bible and studies the Bible, and then tries to bring that Bible into our world today, we need to know that the Bible actually has a very different message. That Jesus reminds us that even if we don't have housing or adequate food, even if our kids go to schools that are failing, even if we work way too hard for way too little, it doesn't have to be this way. It's not what God wants. It's not God's will. And he reminds us that it's our responsibility to our community, to our country, and to God to build a movement that can end poverty and end homelessness. And Jesus reminds these the same ones who are experiencing poverty and homelessness just like him, that we're supposed to let our light shine. We're not supposed to hide it under a bushel. We're supposed to give our bodies and our minds and our souls to uplifting the human condition. And this idea that the way that you honor God, a creator, by protecting the vulnerable and loving your neighbor and taking care of each other, isn't just an idea in Christianity. It's an idea that runs through all of the world's religions. And so, I came to a lot of this work because when we were organizing amongst the homeless in Philadelphia, we took over an abandoned church. And the priests of that church wanted to kick us out. And so some folks brought a poster and hung it up on the walls. And it said, "Why do we worship a homeless man on Sunday, but ignore one on Monday?" And I have that poster still hanging up next to where I sleep. It's a reminder of what society is supposed to do in the face of poverty, in the face of racism, in the face of homelessness, in the face of the devastation of our communities. And who it is that can be those who change the world to make it the way it's supposed to be. We can't forget this passage I referenced earlier, where the sick person goes to Jesus and says, "If you choose, you can heal me." Because indeed, if our society decided to end homelessness, it could. If our politicians decided to pay people living wages, they could. Poverty is not a necessity. It is a sin against God. And it's totally made up. We just don't have the will. We don't have the power. We don't have the organization. And so that is why, as Richard says, we're going to organize, organize, organize. So indeed there is an emergency in this country. And it's getting worse. Here in 2019, there are 140 million people who are poor and low income. That's almost half of the US population. More people die every year. 250,000 people die every year from poverty. That's more than who die from heart attacks and strokes and cancer combined. This winter, 700 homeless people will freeze to death. But we have enough housing to go around. And we live in a country where we pay 53 cents of every discretionary dollar for the military. For things like the police to come and take our stuff away from us. Yeah. But less than 15 cents on health care and education and anti-poverty programs and help. The priorities are all wrong. But it doesn't have to be this way. Because we're here on Martin Luther King Day. And he has a different message for us. He says, "We are called upon to help the discouraged beggars in life's marketplace. But one day we must come to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. It means that questions must be raised. And you see, my friends, when you deal with this, you begin to ask the question, who owns the oil? You begin to ask the question, who owns the iron ore? You begin to ask the question, why is it that people have to pay water bills in a world that's 2/3 water?
Amen.
So, the only way we can honor Dr. King on his 90th birthday, 50 years after he was killed for trying to unite poor people across race, across geography, into a powerful poor people's campaign, is to take up the baton and carry it the next mile. It's the only way. So if we're not doing that work of trying to organize and unite poor people all over this country, we're not truly honoring King. And we can't just take up the work, but we have to ask the questions that King was asking. I was in Michigan last week with more witnesses from the Poor People's Campaign who were arrested during the 40 days. Arrested for trying to shut down the Department of Environmental Quality, the same department that was in charge of overseeing the poisoning of the people of Flint. The same department that was overseeing the hundreds of thousands of people whose water has been shut off in Detroit, who've lost their homes and become homeless, and their kids have been taken away because they don't have a home, because they don't have water. This question, if we live in a world that's 2/3 oil and 2/3 water, why do we have to pay these water bills? I think is pretty relevant still for us today. Or driving around paradise, talking about the problem of climate change. Do you know that $20 billion are given to the fossil fuel industry? But have we seen almost any help for folks that are victims of climate change and disasters caused by climate change? Got to ask these questions. Who owns this? So that we can figure out what are we going to be able to do to organize ourselves out of this situation. And I bet you all here, just like I do, have a bunch of questions our own selves. I mean, a question I have is, why do we have so many poor people in this very rich society? Why do we have to fight over crumbs when there's more than enough to go around? I often ask this question to myself, when is this suffering going to end? Because as we start to ask those questions, we begin to shift the narrative and shift the narrator. We start to talk about the real issues of our day. We begin to defeat the lies that we should blame immigrants or the homeless or the victims of storms or those that were poor before the storms even hit. And instead we can start seeing that when the poor take action together, we can build a movement that can change life for the better for everyone. And I see people here in Northern California beginning to come together. And Dr. King had a lot to say about this coming together as well. I think you probably are aware, but this divide and conquer tactic isn't that new. They're not just doing it amongst the fire victims and those that were homeless in Chico over the last couple of months. And Dr. King has a very powerful thing to say about this. He said this the night before he was killed, when he was in Memphis with striking sanitation workers, trying to build the Poor People's Campaign. He said, you know, whenever Pharaoh wanted to prolong the period of slavery in Egypt, he had a favorite formula for doing it. And what was that? He kept the slaves fighting among themselves. But whenever the slaves get together, something happens in Pharaoh's court, and he cannot hold the slaves in slavery. When the slaves get together, that's the beginning of getting out of slavery. So as we were traveling today around Northern California, around Chico and Paradise and here in Marysville, and as we met with people who are coming together and organizing, I'm here to say that something's happening in Pharaoh's court. Maybe it's the Marysville County Court. Maybe it's about some of the other courts we're all fighting in. But this idea that the beginning of getting out of poverty is when people begin to come together. That's a powerful idea. And a powerful idea, when put into practice, like you all are putting it into practice, has the power to change everything. So, in this sanctuary this evening, I see people that engaged in the largest wave of nonviolent civil disobedience in the 21st century. Folks that step forward to be a part of the Poor People's Campaign and engaged in nonviolent civil disobedience and organizing and mobilizing and educating. And many of us that were arrested during the nonviolent civil disobedience of the 40 days didn't get arrested because we thought another arrest was a good idea. I myself have been arrested enough for other kinds of things. We engaged in this direct action because there comes a time when we are compelled to change unjust laws.
Got it.
When I organized in the Homeless Union about 20 years ago, we would go to different towns and cities where people were organizing other homeless unions, and where people were being evicted from their homes, people being pushed out of their tents. And we had this idea that if we stayed in the home that we were being evicted from, we were illegal, but we lived. If we got evicted and filed that eviction notice, we were legal, but many of us started to die. It raises the question of unjust laws and what you do in the face of injustice to challenge those laws. So I want to finish with one more quote from Dr. King. He says, "There comes a time when a moral man can't obey a law which his conscience tells him is unjust. And I tell you this morning, my friends, that history has moved on, and great moments have often come forth because there were those individuals in every age, in every generation, who were willing to say, I will be obedient to a higher law. These men were saying, I must be disobedient to a king in order to be obedient to the king. Never forget that everything that Hitler did in Germany was legal. It was legal to do everything that Hitler did to the Jews. It was a law in Germany that Hitler issued himself that it was wrong and illegal to aid and comfort a Jew in Hitler's Germany. But I tell you, if I had lived in Hitler's Germany with my attitude, I would have openly broken that law. I would have practiced civil disobedience. And so it is important to see that there are times when a man-made law is out of harmony with the moral law of the universe. There are times when human law is out of harmony with eternal and divine laws. And when that happens, you have an obligation to break it. And that I'm happy that in breaking it, I have some good company. I have Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, I have Jesus and Socrates, and I have all of the early Christians who refused to bow. So, I think this is pretty true today. So what I want to do for a minute is to recognize those of you, especially from the Homeless Union, from the California Poor People's Campaign, who have stepped forward and said that you refuse to bow. You refuse to bow to unjust anti-homeless laws and practices. You refuse to bow to the unjust closure of emergency shelters. You refuse to bow to leaders who are trying to divide us with racism and xenophobia and classism. You refuse to bow to the injustice of poverty and homelessness. We know from history, we know from today, that somebody is hurting our brother, somebody is hurting our sister, somebody is poisoning our water, somebody is letting our communities burn, somebody is making us homeless. And we've been silent for far too long, and we won't be silent anymore. We had a saying and a slogan when I was a part of the Homeless Union that was, you only get what you're organized to take. You only get what you're organized to take. And that's about taking back our dignity and our humanity. It's about taking back our housing and the resources that are ours. And it's about refusing to be silent in the face of evil and injustice. Refusing to be divided from people who all need a better life. The only way we can honor Dr. King is if we decide to step up and stand up and not bow to injustice. Live into a higher law and say, we can win. We can organize, we can mobilize, we can build the biggest movement this town, this state, this country has ever seen. Led by those who are most impacted. Because in the words of Frederick Douglass, only those of us in pain know when our pain is relieved. Yes. And we can band together with people from all walks of life. Clergy and activists and advocates and folks that are morally injured by the poverty and homelessness in our society. And we can bring about a moral revival in this land. I'm very heartened to see what people are doing in this part of the country. And just like I will read Raylan's testimony to many communities that I will travel to this next week and 2 weeks and 3 weeks, going to tell the story of the resurrection that's happening in paradise, in Chico, in Marysville, in California, where people are coming together and out of our bruised and battered bodies, building something that is beautiful and life-giving, and what God wants for all of us. People have done it before. We can do it even better. Thank God for the Homeless Union. Thank God for all of you who have stepped forward to say, we're not going to bow to injustice anymore.